At its peak, one company had a private army of 260,000 soldiers. That was twice the size of the British Army. It collected taxes from over 100 million people. It supplied a tenth of the British government's entire revenue. And any investor with enough money could buy shares in it on the open market, which meant, for a while, that the government of India could be influenced by anyone willing to buy enough stock. By the end of this video, you'll know what it actually cost to run the most powerful corporation in history, how its collapse in 1772 accidentally created the United States of America, and why the most famous statistic in this entire genre, the claim that an East India Company was once worth $7.9 trillion, is probably wrong. Let's start with how a company buys a country. On the 31st of December 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter granting a group of London merchants a monopoly on English trade with the East Indies. The Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, the East India Company, was born as a joint stock company. Investors pooled money, the company sent ships to Asia, and the profits were divided by share. For its first century and a half, that's all it was. A trading company, it bought spices, cotton, silk, and tea in Asia, shipped them back to Europe, and sold them at an enormous markup. It built fortified trading posts, Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, and it paid local rulers for the right to operate. The business was dangerous, slow, and spectacularly profitable. Then, in 1757, the company stopped being a business and became something no corporation had ever been before or has ever been since. The Mughal Empire, which had ruled India for 2 centuries, was collapsing. Regional rulers were fighting for the pieces. And in Bengal, the richest province in India, the local ruler, the Nawab, attacked the company's base in Calcutta. The company's response was led by a man named Robert Clive. Clive had joined the East India Company as a clerk, a bookkeeper. By 1757, he was commanding its private troops. At the Battle of Plassey, Clive faced the Nawab's army of roughly 50,000 men with about 3,000, and won, mostly by bribing the Nawab's own commanders to stand aside before the fighting started. The prize was not a trade route, the prize was Bengal itself. In the aftermath, the company extracted roughly £2.5 million from the Bengal treasury. Over £250 million in today's money. Clive personally took £160,000, which he later described as restrained under the circumstances. Then came the transaction that changed corporate history. In 1765, after another victory at Buxar, the weakened Mughal emperor signed over to the East India Company the Diwani, the legal right to collect land taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Read that again. A private, publicly traded, for-profit corporation, headquartered on a street in London, was now the official tax collector for tens of millions of people on another continent. In the years that followed, the company's stock price rose 263%. This is the moment the East India Company became the strangest asset ever available to a private investor. Its shareholders were no longer buying a share of a spice business, they were buying a share of tax revenue extracted from an entire civilization. The Court of Proprietors, the shareholder assembly, elected the 24 directors every year, and shareholder votes shaped what the company did in India, which meant that in the 1760s and 70s, votes over the governance of Bengal could quite literally be bought by buying stock. Wealthy men did exactly that, and the returning company men, the officials who came home from India with fortunes, bought something else: estates and seats in Parliament. 200 to 300 of them came back between the 1760s and 80s. The British called them nabobs and despised them and elected them anyway. The company wasn't just extracting wealth from India, it was quietly buying influence over the government that was supposed to regulate it. Now, what does it cost to run a country as a business? Mostly, it costs an army. The company maintained 3 armies, one for each of its presidencies: Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. By the early 1800s, these forces totaled roughly 260,000 men, peaking near 280,000, twice the size of the British Army itself. By 1823, the Bengal Army alone had nearly 130,000 soldiers. The officers were British. The vast majority of the soldiers were Indian sepoys, fighting under a corporate flag. By the end of the 1700s, the East India Company was spending half of its entire income on military personnel and hardware. Half. Picture a modern corporation whose defense budget equals everything else it does combined. That was the cost structure of running India as a private enterprise. The company also fought its wars on credit and taxation. The wars expanded the territory paid the taxes funded the next war. As a growth model, it worked, as long as nothing went wrong. In 1769, something went catastrophically wrong. Drought hit Bengal. Under the old Mughal system, rulers had stockpiled grain and cut taxes during famines. The company did neither. It kept collecting taxes at full rates, and grain that could have fed the starving was traded for profit. The famine of 1769 to 1770 killed millions of people. Estimates run as high as 10 million. It remains one of the deadliest failures of governance in recorded history, and it was administered not by a king or an emperor, but by a corporation answerable to shareholders in London. The famine also destroyed the company's own revenue base. Dead farmers pay no land tax, and this is where the company's story collides with a stock market bubble. Through the early 1770s, speculators in London and Amsterdam had been bidding East India stock up on the assumption that the Bengal money machine would run forever. In the summer of 1772, a banker named Alexander Fordyce bet the other way. He shorted East India stock, lost £300,000 and fled to France, leaving his bank to collapse. The panic spread. 20 to 30 banks across Europe failed in the credit crisis that followed, and the East India Company, sitting on £1.2 million of debts in India and warehouses full of unsold tea, went to the Bank of England for a loan and was refused. The most powerful corporation on earth was suddenly weeks from bankruptcy, and the British government faced a question no government had faced before. Can you let a company fail when the company is also the government of Bengal, the employer of 250,000 soldiers, and the source of 1/10 of your national revenue? The answer was no. Parliament arranged an emergency loan of over £1 million. It was, in every way that matters, the first too-big-to-fail bailout in history, 2.5 centuries before anyone used the phrase. But the bailout came with a scheme attached. The company's warehouses held a mountain of unsold tea. To help the company move it, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, giving the East India Company the right to ship tea directly to the American colonies, undercutting the colonial merchants. The colonists understood exactly what they were looking at: a government using its power to rescue a politically connected corporation at their expense. In December of 1773, colonists boarded the company's ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of East India Company tea into the sea. The Boston Tea Party was not, at its core, a protest about tea. It was a protest about a corporate bailout. The road to the American Revolution runs directly through the balance sheet of the East India Company. When the company's stock collapsed in London, the United States of America became inevitable. From that point on, the company lived on a leash that kept getting shorter. The Regulating Act of 1773 put a government-approved governor-general over its Indian territories. Pitt's India Act of 1784 put political policy under a board answerable to Parliament. In 1813, the company lost its monopoly on trade with India. In 1833, it lost the China trade too. The corporation that had conquered a subcontinent spent its final decades as something much stranger, a private company administering India on the government's behalf, a contractor running a country it used to own. The end came in 1857 when a rebellion swept northern India, triggered within the company's own Bengal army and fed by a century of grievances against company rule. It took over a year of brutal fighting to suppress. And when it was over, the British government concluded what everyone already knew. A corporation cannot be trusted to run 200 million lives. The Government of India Act of 1858 transferred all company territories to the British Crown. The company's army became the British Indian Army. The company's country became the British Raj. The East India Company itself lingered on paper for another decade and a half, a corporate ghost with no business left. In 1874, under the East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act, its remaining shareholders were paid off and the company was dissolved. The most powerful corporation in history didn't go bankrupt and didn't get outcompeted. It was absorbed by the only entity large enough to swallow it, the state it had spent 2 centuries feeding. Now, the $7.9 trillion question. If you've watched videos in this genre, you've seen the claim. An East India Company was once worth $7.9 trillion, more than Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon combined. The claim is usually attached to the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, a separate rival corporation founded in Amsterdam in 1602. The VOC genuinely was a landmark. It ran the world's first true IPO. Over 1,100 ordinary citizens bought in, and its shares created the world's first stock exchange. Every publicly traded company on Earth is, structurally, its descendant. But the $7.9 trillion figure comes from taking the VOC's peak share price during the Tulip Mania of 1637 and converting 17th century guilders to modern dollars using a conversion rate that economic historians consider wildly inflated. Researchers who have actually worked through the Dutch records using real inflation data going back to the 1400s put the VOC's actual 1637 market value in the low hundreds of millions in today's money, not trillions. The trillion-dollar VOC is one of the most repeated statistics on the internet, and it is almost certainly fiction, recycled from one infographic to the next for a decade. Here's what's strange, though. The real numbers don't need the exaggeration. A company that commanded 260,000 soldiers. A company that collected the taxes of 100 million people. A company whose customs duties alone supplied 1/10 of the British state's revenue, whose bailout sparked the American Revolution, and whose dissolution required an act of parliament and the creation of an empire to replace it. No modern corporation, not Apple, not Aramco, not anyone, has ever held that kind of power. Market capitalization measures what investors will pay for a company. It has no column for owning the tax base of a subcontinent. So, if you take one thing from the story of the East India Company, make it the rule that every government since has quietly lived by. A company can be allowed to own almost anything. Ships, land, warehouses, even for a while, an army. What it can never be allowed to own is the thing the East India Company actually owned. The point where the government needs the company more than the company needs the government. The East India Company crossed that line in 1765. It took the British state 93 years to claw its way back across. And no state has ever let a company get that close again.